In the previous section, we have seen how exactly we can ask the user to enter an input. Upon user entering a value, we were able to get that value using AppJS file. And also, when the user interacts on this button by clicking on this button, we were able to display that information here. That is what we have done as a part of our previous exercise. We'll just take this component to the next level, where in which the requirement remains same, where the user would be asked to enter the name. And this time, what I want is, I want a checkbox to be available, which should say, do you want to receive the notifications from us? If the user checks the checkbox, he should be presented with a screen where he would be asked to enter his email address, his or her email address. So if he doesn't check this checkbox, we just say hello. That's it. Hello, the name that has been entered here. So that is what we'll do here as a part of our requirement. So what we need, we would have the component as it is. The only changes that we need to make is we need to add a checkbox here. If the user checks the checkbox, there should be a new section that come up which should ask for the email address of the user. So that is what the change that we are implementing as a part of this section. Since our requirement is clear, we can jump out to our VS Code to start building that requirement. So this is my HTML file. I'm just minimizing this Explorer. So now what we did, we have this input text. So I've also called out that I need one more input text. For what? For email address. So what I'll do, I'll just paste that here. Now, do I want this input field every time? The answer is no. And is it a text field? Yes, it can be a text field, but I'll just go back to the documentation to see if there is anything specific for the email address. I'll go back to the examples to see if there is anything for the email input. So I have an email input that is there. How is this input different from the previous one? The type says email here. So instead of me going ahead with a normal text value, I'll copy this code, go back to my VS Code and just update that accordingly. Why am I doing it? I want this field to be more specific for the requirement that I have. I could have done it with this input field itself. Having the email input field would give me that advantage of getting the right email address format from the user. Does that field needs to be displayed every time? The answer is no. We also need a checkbox which should decide whether this field needs to be visible or not. Now, how do I get the checkbox as an input field? Again, I'm going back to the same input field documentation to look for if there is any input field with of type checkbox. So I also have an example for it. I've selected that. So I'll just take the basic input field that helps me give the checkbox here. The only difference that we would see in both of these fields is type is something that is changing. If it is a checkbox field, the type is set to checkbox. If it is an email field, the type is set to email. So what is the label that I wanted to display? The label that I wanted to display for the checkbox is, do you want us to send the email notification? So this is what I wanted the user to decide whether they want the notifications or not. All right, so this is what we have done. Let's deploy these changes to see how does it look on the UI. So do a right click on your component, deploy source to the org, go back to your Salesforce org. Once the deployment is successful, refresh your screen. If you see here, we are able to set that checkbox here with the description. And also this time the email address is also present, which is good. But what is happening here, I want to only show this email address once the checkbox is being checked. If the checkbox has not been checked, I do not want to display this email address. So because no one wants to see an email address as a field if they do not want to opt in for that email notifications that we are sending. Now, how do I hide this email address? Now, what I wanted to do here, I want to conditionally render this email input field once this checkbox is checked. Now, how do I show or hide this input field? That is where I'll be taking the help of my template here. Now I have an option where I can decide when I need to show this template to the users or when I need to show this section. As of now, I'm not writing anything here. For time being, I'll put a placeholder here. Right. So now what I'll do, I'll be writing a variable or I'll be writing a property that decides whether this template content needs to be displayed or not. What I'll do here, I'll just add some simple text for our demo. This is inside the template. I'm just writing some text, static text here before me moving these changes to my template. Now what I'll do, for simplicity, I'll go back to my JS file, create an property which says show. I'll simply name it as show temp. I'll simply create a component called show temp, and by default, I'll set that value to true. Right, I have a variable which is show temp, and I'm using that variable in my component here. Now I've added that property here. Now what would happen? System would go ahead and look at this property. If this value is set, then this condition is set to true, then it would display this information. Else it would not. In my case, I do not have an else option where I hard coded this value to true. So that is why it should be always be displaying. So let's do one deployment with true value, and then we'll see what would happen if I set it to false. I've deployed the changes. Let's go back to our Salesforce org, do a hard refresh. And now if you see here, every time I see this, this is inside the template being shown just above my email address. Now, what would happen if I set that value to false from the JS file? So if I go to the JS file, instead of setting it to true, I'll just set it to false. Deploy the components once more. Changes are being deployed. Let's go back to our Salesforce org, do a hard refresh. And if you see this time, I do not see that this is inside the template, the static text not been displayed. The reason being, here inside my template, this condition is set to false. It is looking for a true value, but this time it is set to false. If true, then show this content. Since it is false, this is not been shown, it has been hidden. Now, if you look at this exercise closely, we are able to achieve what we need. What I meant by that, if I move this email address field into this template, inside this template tag. Now what would happen if this value is set to true, then this email address field would be displayed. If it is set to false, then this email address input would not be displayed to the end user. How do I control this? Show template as a property. Now that control is in this section. The control is in this section. Now, if the user checks this checkbox, that is where I would be setting this value as true. If the user has not set this, check that checkbox, by default, I'll be setting this show template as false. So this parameter of dynamically changing this show temp resides in what exactly the user is doing with this checkbox field. Now again, how do I get to know what is happening on this input field? If you remember, this is what we have done earlier also. We have used the onChange function. So I'll copy that same syntax from above and use it in my input field. Am I worried in the email address field at this point of time? The answer is no. I'm just trying to show or hide this email address depending on what is the user doing on this checkbox. Since I cannot have the same names in the function, so I'll just change it as, for readability, I'll just change the function that has been used for the checkbox as handle onChange checkbox. handle on change checkbox. So this is my function. Do I have this function defined in my JS file? The answer is no. So let's go ahead and define that JS file. Again, there is an event that this checkbox also would be firing. So that event would be checked or unchecked. So that is why I'm looking at that event. In order for me to understand if it is working or not, I'll simply put a console log here. The checkbox is, I want to dynamically get that value. How do I do that? Event dot target dot is clicked, is checked. All right, so this is the syntax that I've written. Earlier we were using event dot target dot value to get the value that has been entered in that text box. Since it is a checkbox here, I have used target dot checked. If it is set to true, this would be returning it as true, else it would not. So let's deploy this change. A change just got deployed. Let's switch to our Salesforce org. Do a hard refresh. At the same time, I'll also inspect the element to look at my console logs that get printed. Now, if you see here, the template that I have is hidden. And if I check that checkbox here, it says that checkbox is true. It is going into the function. If I uncheck this one, it is saying as this checkbox is false. If I check it again, it says true. If I uncheck it is setting to false. So my functionality is working fine, where I am able to understand whether the checkbox is set to true or false. From the functionality perspective, I can understand whether the user has checked this checkbox or unchecked this checkbox. Now I have a value that I can pass or I can use, which is set to true or false. Now if I go back to my VS Code here and use that understanding that I've just got now, this value is giving me true or false. Now what is that value that I need to set it to? I need to set this value that I'm getting from the UI to this show template. Depending on that, it would dynamically change depending on what exactly the user is doing. So I'll say this dot show template is equals the value that I've attained here, event dot target dot checked. Simply save these changes. Initially, I'm setting it to false. So what would happen when the component loads? This template would not be displaying this email field. Once this value has been set to true, if the checkbox has been checked here, then it would display this email address input to the end user where they can enter it. So let's deploy these changes here. Again, how do you get this information into your JS file? Simply use onChange event to get that information into your field. Our changes got deployed. Let's go to our Salesforce org. Do a hard refresh. What is expected here? Initially, when the component loads, I should not be seeing that email address field. Let's check that out. Do I see that email address field? The answer is no. Now, when I check this checkbox, that is where it is asking me to enter that email address. Once I uncheck this checkbox, that email address is gone. And do I have the same functionality that I was using earlier? So I've entered a name here, clicked on display message, and it is showing hello RR. So this is how you can basically conditionally render components that are being added onto your LWC component. What is that component that is dynamically rendering here? If I check this checkbox, that email input field component is shown, or it has been hidden depending on the action that I'm doing on this checkbox. If I uncheck it, it is hidden. If I check this checkbox, it is coming up. So that is how you can toggle between the things where you can hide or show the component that you have. So that is the end of this section where we have looked at how we can render the DOM elements conditionally in your LWC component.
Hey guys, if you like this video, do like, share and subscribe to SFDC Quest.